Julia's Fairy Tales. The Well of Memories.
In Erlengrund, there lived a woman named Elsbeth, and she was the keeper of the well at the wood's edge. The well filled only for the hand of her line. Each morning, Elsbeth knelt at the stone rim and whispered a memory into the descending bucket, and the bucket came up full, but the memory was gone from her. This was the price of the water, and every keeper had paid it. On Martinmas Eve, the village set a long table beneath the big apple tree and hung lanterns in the branches. Geese turned on the spit. The water in every pitcher was cold and sweet from Elsbeth's hand. To thank her, the beekeeper brought a jar of honey. The candlemaker's wife brought wool, and Hilde, who sat nearest, pressed a paper of dried thyme into Elsbeth's palm. Hilde's grandmother had planted the apple sapling 60 years before, she explained. The table was full of joy. At the far end was an empty chair for Elsbeth's mother, who had died in the spring after she couldn't even remember her own name. Elsbeth walked home alone and realized that there were not many memories left in her to give. She knelt at the well before dawn. The rope was cold in her palm. For a long time, she stayed there and did not speak. At last, she leaned over the rim and whispered, her grandmother's hands, coated in flour, pressing dough on the board. The way the old woman's fingers folded the dough over and over in the morning light, while Elsbeth sat on the kitchen stool and watched. The smell of the bread and the pleasure of eating from the loaf fresh out of the oven. The bucket came up only half full to the second iron band and no higher. She lowered the bucket again. As it fell, she remembered Hilde's story from the night before. Old Marta's careful hands in the wet earth, the sapling held upright until it could stand on its own. Elsbeth whispered Hilde's name into the well. This time, the bucket was brimming over the rim. Water spilled down the stone. It was colder than it had been in a long time. When the villagers came for their pitchers that morning, the first to drink was the smith's boy, and he said it tasted as if it was from God's personal pond. The others laughed and filled their pitchers and said it was just like that. That afternoon, Hilde walked past the apple tree and stopped. She put her hand on the bark and stood there, looking up into the branches. "It's such a majestic tree," Hilde said, and laughed. "I wonder how long it has been here." Before dawn, the rope was cold in Elsbeth's palm again. She knelt at the rim and thought of the farrier's wife years ago, a summer afternoon, bees loud in the clover behind the forge. The farrier's wife had been young then, and she had worn a blue dress, the color of the sky above the meadow, and she had laughed with her whole throat while the bees worked. Elsbeth whispered the farrier's wife's name into the descending bucket. It came up, brimming to the iron rim. The water tasted of summer. All day the pitchers stayed cold, and the village drank well. That evening, the farrier's wife told her daughter about a dress she had once owned, a favorite, and she stopped. "It was the blue one," her daughter said. "You told me many times." "Did I?" she replied, smiling. Weeks passed. Each morning the rope was cold in her palm. The candlemaker. The day before, the goatherd's widow. Before that, the shepherd on the hill. Tomorrow, the smith's mother. She rotated through the names, never the same twice, never two from the same house in succession. On Sundays, the village set bread and cheese on the long table beneath the apple tree, and Elsbeth sat among them and filled the pitchers and ate and listened. When Hilde asked after the well, Elsbeth said the well was as it had always been. She passed the bread. She poured the water. The water was the sweetest in living memory. Children ran to the wooden dipper and drank with their eyes closed in delight before running back to their games, mouths shining. One morning, she knelt at the stone rim and whispered the midwife's name. The bucket went down. It came up once again, only half full and no higher. She had spoken that name before. She had spoken every name she could speak. The goatherd's widow she only knew in passing from the autumn market. The shepherd on the hill she knew only by his walk. All names were spent, and the well had taken them easily, the way a stone takes rain. What remained were the faces she saw each day. Klaus, the miller's son, passed her door every morning with a sack of flour on his shoulder. He was young. He had a crooked tooth and dark eyes and a jaw like his father's, and when he smiled, the tooth showed, and the children on the lane smiled back. Before dawn, the rope was cold in her palm. She knelt at the rim and did not reach for a story. She reached for his face. The jaw, the crooked tooth, the dark eyes. She whispered his name into the descending bucket. It came up overflowing. The water was so fresh her fingers ached on the rope. That evening, Klaus saw his face in the mirror. He looked at it for a long time. He touched his jaw. He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked again. His mother found him there weeping. She put her arms around him and asked what had happened. He did not know whose face was in the mirror.
Elsbeth has fed her neighbours' names to the well for water, and Klaus no longer recognises his own face. This fairy tale is not over, but do you already have an idea about its meaning? Share it in the comments. Julia's Fairy Tales, The Well of Memories, Part 2.
Elsbeth knelt at the well. The rope was cold in her palm. She swore she would give no more names. She leaned over the rim and whispered her own. Not the small memories. She gave the morning of her wedding, the linden tree in full flower outside the church door, her husband's hands, rough and warm, taking hers on the stone step, the light through the linden leaves on his collar, the smell of the blossoms so thick she could taste it. A memory she had cherished for 40 years. The bucket went down. It hung a long time in the dark. When it came up, the water stood below the third iron band, and no more. She leaned over the rim in desperation and gave the last spring of her grandmother's life. The old woman in the doorway with her face to the sun, her eyes already empty, her hands folded in her lap. Elsbeth had sat beside her and held her hand. The bucket went down, hanging in the dark even longer than before. But when it came up, the water had only risen to the second iron band. She set the bucket on the stone in tears. The water sat flat and dark and still. Hilde came up the path to the well without speaking. She walked to the rim, sat on the stone, and folded her hands in her lap. Elsbeth stood at the rope. The rope was cold in her palm. Hilde looked down the well, then at Elsbeth. "I know," she said, "for some weeks already. Drink from me, spare the rest." Elsbeth shook her head. She whispered, her mother's voice singing on a winter night, the one song she still remembered, the words already half gone. The bucket came back dry. Hilde had not moved. Elsbeth finally gave in and whispered Hilde's full name, the way one speaks a child's name, slowly, each part set down with care. The bucket went down. From far below came a long, soft sound, low and deep, as of water gushing out of stone. Hilde was smiling. She looked out at the path and the trees and the village below. Her eyes were clear and empty. She did not know why she had come, or what her name was. The bucket came up full to the iron rim. The water was so cold it stung her throat when she drank. There was no sweetness in it. The next morning she walked to the well, and Hilde was already there. She sat on the same stone, hands lying in her lap, cupped, palms up, open, as if waiting for rain. Elsbeth went home. She bolted the door. She did not go back to the well that day. She did not go the next. On the third night, she heard the rope. Through the bolted door, through the dark, the creak of hemp on stone. The bucket going down. The bucket coming up. No voice, no name whispered. The rope moved on its own. The farrier picked up his hammer and held it in both hands and turned it over and set it down. He could not remember how to use it. A woman on the other side of the street woke beside her husband and looked at him and could not remember who he was. Old Gerhard sat at his table with his 3 children and looked from face to face and could not recognize them. All of them smiled and went about their days with the mild good cheer of those who have been relieved of something heavy. At dawn, Elsbeth stood at the well, unable to speak. The bucket hung on its rope, then began to descend on its own, the hemp sliding against the cold stone as it fell into the dark. When it came up, it was cold and full, without a single hand having touched the rope. Outside the well, in a half-circle, stood Hilde the candlemaker, Klaus the midwife, the shepherd, the farrier's wife, and the goatherd's widow. Their faces were blank. They were smiling with their hands cupped before them. The bucket tipped and the water poured. They drank with their eyes closed. Across Erlengrund, doors opened, and from the south lane and the north, from the houses near the mill and the houses below the church, more came through the cold air calmly, drawn as if by a smell they could not name. They had walked to the well before sunrise without remembering why. They joined the half-circle and cupped their hands.
Elsbeth bolted her door against the well, but each dawn the villagers gather around it on their own, with empty faces. The story will continue shortly. If you are enjoying it, please leave a like and subscribe for more. Julia's Fairy Tales. The Well of Memories. Part 3.
Elsbeth sat at the kitchen table. She recited the villagers' names to no one. They meant nothing to anyone but her. She remembered the apple sapling in the wet earth and old Marta's careful hands. The farrier's wife in a blue dress with the bees loud in the clover behind the forge. Klaus's crooked tooth and dark eyes, and the children on the lane smiling back. No one else in Erlengrund did. She walked through the village in the thin winter light. The water still came, the bucket still poured. The villagers drank from their cupped hands each morning and went about their days. She stopped at Hilde's gate and said her name. Hilde looked up from the garden and smiled. She called the farrier's wives across the fence. The woman nodded pleasantly. She said Klaus's name on the lane by the mill. He shifted the flour sack on his shoulder and smiled his crooked smile and walked on. She walked the whole village that way, saying each name back to its owner. And each time the owner smiled and nodded. The pictures stood full on every table. Elsbeth grew old. The villagers did not. They did not age the way Elsbeth aged. Their hair did not grey. Their backs did not bend. Whatever the well took from them each morning, it took so little now that what remained was enough to keep them walking and smiling, but nothing more. Children were born in Erlengrund. Their mothers held them and fed them and did not sing. No one told them stories. No one spoke the names of the dead. The children grew with only their own thin years to carry. A few summers, a few winters. The sound of water that is being poured into a cup. The bucket came up to the third iron band, then the fourth, then dry. On a morning in early spring, a boy came to the well with an empty pitcher tilted against his hip. Elsbeth knelt beside him. Her knees were stiff, her hands spotted, and her back bent. She looked at his face and spoke his name, the one his mother had given him before she forgot it, and her own. The boy looked at her with open eyes. He looked at his empty pitcher. He looked back at her.
If this tale stayed with you, like, subscribe, and tell me your interpretation in the comments below. Julia's Fairy Tales.